ages of 5 to 13, I lived with my family in an old house perched on a mountain in the middle of nowhere. My father was enamored with the land and had grand plans for it, which is why we moved there. Despite my father's enthusiasm, I never felt settled living in that house. The place had an unsettling aura that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was a large, creaky structure with a worn, weather-beaten exterior that seemed to echo the isolation of our location. The house was surrounded by dense woods, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The isolation was suffocating at times, and I often felt a deep, inexplicable fear when I was alone in the house. The inside was just as eerie as the outside. Long, shadowy hallways and rooms that always seemed too dark, no matter how many lights we turned on. I frequently had nightmares and a constant feeling of being watched, which only added to my discomfort. One particular feature of the house was a peculiar enclosed porch at the front. It wasn't an open-air porch like most, but rather a fully enclosed room with a door that led to the outside. This door was always locked and sealed with a special tape to prevent drafts from entering the house. Despite its intended purpose, that porch always felt like a space that didn't belong, an area that seemed disconnected from the rest of the house. My unease grew over the years, as did the frequency of my nightmares. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that house, but I never had any concrete evidence to prove it. It was just a sense, a gut feeling that something wasn't right. And then, one night, something happened that none of us could explain, something that confirmed my deepest fears. Living in that house on the mountain was a daily battle against an omnipresent sense of fear. From the moment we moved in, an eerie atmosphere seemed to cling to every corner and shadow. I was only a child, but even at that young age, I could sense that something was off. The unease I felt wasn't just a child's fear of the dark or the unknown. It was deeper, more pervasive, like the house itself was alive and watching us. Nightmares became a regular part of my life. I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, the images of terrifying dreams still fresh in my mind. They were vivid and disturbing, filled with shadowy figures and unidentifiable threats lurking just out of sight. These nightmares always left me feeling drained and terrified, and it wasn't long before I began to dread going to sleep at all. The days weren't much better. Even in the daylight, the house felt wrong. Rooms were dark and oppressive, with long hallways seemed to stretch on forever. There were times when I could swear I heard faint whispers, as if the walls themselves were speaking in hushed tones. Constantly felt like I was being watched, hairs on the back of my neck standing on end for no apparent reason. The enclosed porch at the front of the house was particularly unsettling. It was a small room, separated from the rest of the house by a sturdy door that was always kept locked. The door leading outside was sealed with special tape to keep out the draft, but it also felt like it was keeping something else at bay. Porch had windows on all sides. The light that filtered through them always seemed dim and ghostly, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I avoided the porch as much as possible. There was something about that space that made my skin crawl. It felt disconnected from the rest of the house, like a forgotten limb that was still somehow alive. Even though it was supposed to be just an ordinary room, it gave off an air of malevolence that I couldn't explain. Despite my constant fear, I tried to push it to the back of my mind. My parents didn't seem to notice anything unusual, or if they did, they never mentioned it. They were excited about the possibilities the land offered and focused on their plans. I didn't want to burden them with my fears, so I kept my feelings to myself. The fear never went away. It was a constant companion, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, my worst fears were realized. It was late, the kind of late where the house was shrouded in darkness and the silence was thick and oppressive. I had finally managed to fall into a fitful sleep when I was abruptly woken by a loud, jarring noise from downstairs. It sounded like a door being slammed with tremendous force. My heart leaped into my throat as I bolted upright in bed, my ears straining to catch any follow-up sounds. I wasn't the only one who heard it. Moments later, my parents' bedroom door creaked open, and I could see the faint outlines of their figures moving cautiously into the hallway. My mother's face was pale and worried, while my father wore a mask of tense determination. We all converged in the hallway, our eyes wide with fear and confusion. The air was thick with tension, each of us holding our breath, waiting for another sound. "What was that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't know," my father replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to find out." We moved as a unit, slowly and cautiously making our way to the staircase. My father led the way, followed closely by my mother, with me bringing up the rear. Each step creaked ominously under our weight, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent house. The further we descended, the colder and more oppressive the air seemed to become. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, my father signaled for us to stop. We listened intently, straining to hear any movement or noise that might give away the source of the bang. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you from all sides. My father took a deep breath and motioned for us to follow him into the living room. As we turned the corner, the sight that met our eyes sent chills down my spine. The door to the enclosed porch was wide open. The tape that had sealed it shut was hanging in tatters, and the lock that was always secure was now undone. The porch door itself seemed to gape at us, a dark void leading to the outside world. We stood there, frozen in shock and fear. My father finally broke the paralysis, moving quickly to check the door and the surrounding area. My mother and I stayed close together, our eyes darting around the room, expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows. After a thorough inspection, my father confirmed that no one was there. The intruder, if there had been one, was long gone. We couldn't find any signs of forced entry or clues as to how the door had been opened. The only evidence of the disturbance was the open door and the ruined tape. We reluctantly closed the door, retaping it as best as we could. The rest of the night was spent in restless vigilance, none of us able to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over us. The sense of security that our home had once provided was shattered, replaced by an ever-present fear that lingered long after the incident had passed. As we stood there in the dim light of the living room, our eyes fixated on the open porch door, a wave of fear and confusion washed over us. The door, which had always been securely locked and sealed with special tape to prevent drafts, was now wide open. The tape hung in shreds, fluttering slightly in the cold night air, and the lock was inexplicably undone. It was as if the door had been violently forced open from the inside, but there were no signs of anyone or anything that could have done it. My father approached the door cautiously, his eyes scanning every inch for clues. My mother and I stayed a few steps behind, our hearts pounding in our chests. The scene felt surreal, like something out of one of my nightmares. My father examined the door frame and the lock, his face a mask of concentration and worry. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered, more to himself than to us. "There's no sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. How did this happen?" My mother wrapped her arms around herself, shivering slightly despite the warmth of the living room. "Are you sure it was locked?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Of course it was," my father replied, his tone frustrated and bewildered. "I check it every night before bed. Someone or something must have opened it." We all stood there, staring at the door, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The possibilities raced through my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Had someone broken in? But if so, why hadn't we heard them earlier? And where were they now? "Maybe it was the wind," I suggested weakly, though even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. The door had been sealed tightly, and the wind couldn't have ripped off the tape and undone the lock. My father shook his head. "No, it wasn't the wind. Something, or someone, opened this door." The realization sent a chill down my spine. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest neighbor. If someone had been here, they would have had to trek through the dense woods and the dark of night to reach our house. The thought was terrifying. We spent the next hour combing through the house, checking every room and every possible hiding place. We found nothing out of the ordinary, no signs of an intruder. But the sense of unease remained, hanging over us like a dark cloud. After resealing the door as best as we could, We huddled together in the living room, too scared to go back to bed. My father sat with a baseball bat by his side, his eyes darting towards the door every few minutes. My mother held me close, her hand gently stroking my hair in an attempt to calm both of us. As the night dragged on, the fear and confusion only grew. We tried to come up with logical explanations, but none of them fit the bizarre circumstances. The incident left us all on edge, our once safe home now feeling like a place of unknown dangers. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and we dozed off in the living room, the uneasy silence of the house pressing in around us. When we woke the next morning, the door was still closed, the tape still in place. The memory of that night lingered. Chilling reminder that some mysteries are never truly solved. The incident that night left an indelible mark on our lives. In the days that followed, the house no longer felt like the safe haven it once was. The sense of security had been shattered, replaced by a constant, gnawing fear that something or someone could breach our sanctuary again. My parents did their best to reassure me, but I could see the worry in their eyes, the same fear that kept me awake at night. Every creak and groan of the old house seemed magnified, each one a potential sign of another intrusion. I found myself jumping at shadows, my imagination running wild with the possibilities of what might be lurking just out of sight. The nightmares became more frequent, and the feeling of being watched never quite left me. Even in the daylight, the house felt oppressive, the memory of that night casting a long, dark shadow over everything. My father took extra precautions, checking and rechecking all the locks and seals every night. He even installed additional security measures, but no amount of locks or alarms could erase the fear that had taken root in our minds. My mother tried to keep things normal, but the strain showed. We all tiptoed around the subject, not wanting to acknowledge the possibility that we might never know what truly happened. The mystery of that night remains unresolved to this day. We never found any evidence of an intruder. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. It was as if the door had opened itself, possibility that was as terrifying as it was improbable. We were left with unanswered questions and the chilling memory of that open door, the tape hanging in tatters, and the lock mysteriously undone. Reflecting on it now, I realize how profoundly that night affected me. It wasn't just the fear of an intruder. It was the realization that the world is full of uncertainties and unknowns, and that safety is often an illusion. That night shattered my childhood sense of invincibility, replacing it with a stark awareness of vulnerability. Even as an adult, memory lingers. Every time I hear a strange noise in the night or feel a draft where there shouldn't be one, I'm transported back to that old house on the mountain. The fear never fully goes away. It just becomes a part of you. A constant reminder that sometimes the things we can't explain are the ones that haunt us the most. In the end, we moved away from that house, but the experience followed us. It was a lesson in the fragility of our perceived safety and the enduring impact of unexplained events. And though we left the house behind, the memory of that night remains. Chilling reminder that some mysteries are never truly solved, and some fears never fully fade.